Hi everyone. Let's look at some sine and cosine graphs that have transformations in them. Let's start with y equals 4 sine of 2x. Our amplitude comes from our vertical stretch of the sine function, which is 4. And our period comes from our horizontal compression by 1/2. Again, remember x lies, so since the b value is 2, we're going to compress our period horizontally by 1/2. Or I can just use my 2 pi divided by b formula to get the period. And so the period is going to be pi. That's how often this function is going to repeat its cycle. So I want to draw 2 cycles, and I'm going to start with 0, and I'll have pi, and I'll have negative pi, since that's the length of my period. And then we want the 4 points that the function cycles through. So I'm going to divide my period into 4 pieces. And so pi divided by 4 makes 2 pi over 4. And for sake of simplicity, I'll just use the common denominators. So I'll have negative 3 pi over 4. I'll have negative 2 pi over 4. I'll have negative pi over 4. And then 0, pi over 4, 2 pi over 4, and 3 pi over 4. And then my amplitude will be 4. So my function is going to be bounded between the y values of 4 and negative 4. And you'll recall that the pattern for this sine function, sine of 0 is 0, which starts at the midline, and then it goes to the maximum, and then back to the midline, down to the minimum, and then up to the midline again. And it goes in reverse, the same pattern, the other direction, and then we can just connect our wave. Alright, let's look at another example. So here we have y equals negative 1/2 sine of pi over 3x plus 1. I'll start with the amplitude again. And so we look at the a value. And remember, when we look at amplitude, it's the absolute value. We're only looking at the vertical stretch or compression. So we ignore the negative sign. And our amplitude is going to be 1/2. For our period, we'll use the 2 pi divided by b formula. So 2 pi divided by pi over 3, that'll be like 2 pi times 3 over pi. If we just multiply by the reciprocal, that'll make our period 6 units long. And pi divided by 3, since that's just a little bit bigger than 1, its reciprocal, 3 divided by pi, will be just a little bit smaller than 1. So we have a slight horizontal compression, and the period gets shortened a little bit from 2 pi, approximately 6.28, to 6. We also have the plus 1 there. We have that k, that's going to give us a translation up 1 unit, and so that's going to put our midline at y equals 1. So let's sketch the graph now, and we'll draw 2 cycles of this again. So since the period is 6 units long, we'll draw between -6 and +6. I'll mark our midline at y equals 1, and I'll mark it with a dotted line because it's not really part of the graph. And I know that the function is going to deviate 1/2 unit up and 1/2 unit down from the line y equals 1. And then I'll also break my period into 4 increments. So 6 divided by 4 will be 3/2 or 1.5. So this will be -4.5, then 3, -3, -1.5. We have the y-axis, we have 1.5, 3, 4.5, and 6. We're starting with the sine function, and at 0, sine will be at the midline. And this one is negative sine, so it'll have a reflection. So we'll go down to the minimum first, and then the midline, then the maximum, and then the midline, and working our way backwards through the other side. And then we just finish drawing our curve. So again, you'll see this is a little more vertically compressed sine, and this one happens to be entirely above the x-axis because our midline was at 1 and it only went 1/2 unit in either direction. Try this one on your own. So this one has no vertical stretch factor at all, no a value, so we'll have an amplitude of 1. Our period will be 2 pi divided by 1/4, which is the same as 2 pi times 4. So here we have a horizontal stretch by a factor of 4, and our period will be 8 pi units long, and then the -3 shifts our function down 3 units. So we'll have our midline at y equals -3. Then I'll break my period into 4 increments. So 8 pi divided by 4 puts them all 2 pi apart. I'll draw my midline at y equals -3. And then this is a cosine function. So since cosine of 0 is 1, we know we start at our maximum value for the cosine, and then the midline, the minimum, the midline, and the maximum. And same thing, we go back through it in the other direction. And then I just connect it. So, in summary, if we're graphing a sine or a cosine function, we find the amplitude, the period, and the midline. We break our period into 4 equal increments, and then depending on whether it's sine or cosine, we just go through the cycle between the minimum, the midline, and the maximum, and that's it.